It is widely known that during the 19th century, most women were allowed a single societal role of domesticity and moral code of purity and submissiveness to be considered a true woman. Today, most people agree that this system is oppressive and restricts women and their right to self-determination. This was the way of it in 19th century America, though, and if any woman wanted to gain prominence, renown for achievement, or any other form of societal influence, she must abide by these restrictions. This social covenant was of course also true for black women of the time. It is less emphasized today the burden these ideals laid on them, though enslaved or free, their situation was much more unjust. The main reason is the enslaved women had no freedom to decide their own fate or actions, and free black women had little more to say in their own lives due to strong racial beliefs in the majority of America. In her autobiographical narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs, a former slave living in the mid-1800s, writes on the dreams and struggles of her self-representing character, Linda Brent, to obtain freedom. Jacobs uses social and political bindings of Linda Brent and her actions despite them to change and broaden the definition of true womanhood to include the traits she believes to be womanly in the subjugated slave culture, such as desire for a domestic, free, and pure life for herself and her children, and resourcefulness and determination to achieve this desire. Desire is an important distinction Jacobs makes in the course of her novel. Since slaves are property and cannot legally act on their own free will, Jacobs broadens the definition of the true woman by making the case that a large portion of true womanhood is based in the desire to have some of the traits of true womanhood. Jacobs writes, "I have stated that when Dr. Flint put Ellen in jail at 2 years old, she had an inflammation of the eyes occasioned by measles. This disease still troubled her, and kind Mrs. Bruce proposed that she should come to New York for a while to be under the care of Dr. Elliott, a well-known oculist. It did not occur to me that there would be anything improper in a mother's making such a request, but Mrs. Hobbs was very angry and refused to let her go. Situated as I was, it was not politic to insist upon it. I made no complaint, but I longed to be entirely free to act a mother's part toward my children." In this excerpt, Linda is powerless over how her own daughter is cared for. This does not change her deep desire to care for her child and be the domestic guardian. It also does not change her womanliness. It simply means she is powerless to act as a true white woman would in her vulnerable situation. So more broadly, we may understand that most slave women may not be legally or socially be able to possess the traits of the cult of true womanhood. Therefore, slave women should be judged mainly by their ambitions, not their actions. From early in Linda's life, we can see her hunger for freedom, though it may have seemed impossible to her. She writes, "He that is willing to be a slave, let him be a slave," and "I had not lived 14 years in slavery for nothing. I had felt, seen, and heard enough to read the characters and question the motives of those around me. The war of my life had begun, and though one of God's most powerless creatures, I resolved never to be conquered. Alas for me." These two quotes show that Linda is not the sort of person to accept any part of her life she does not like if she has any power over it. From this perspective, Jacobs is arguing that slave women must desire and work for their freedom. If they do not, they remain caught in the trap of slavery. Jacobs puts the most emphasis on slave women's powerlessness to remain sexually pure. She does this because it is the virtue slave women have the least control over, and so is usually the one on which they are most harshly judged. Patricia Hopkins points this out in her article, Seduction or Rape, by stating, "White women held black women to the same standard, that of the cult of true womanhood, which asserted that womanly virtue resided in piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. For that reason, Brent, though a slave, resists." Jacobs' argument is that slave girls cannot defy their masters even if they demand a sexual act. They also cannot marry as they please. How, then, can these women, though they may resist, be judged by what they are forced to do? She pleads with the reader to understand they should not be. "But O ye happy women, whose purity has been sheltered from childhood, who have been free to choose the objects of your affection, whose homes are protected by law, do not judge the poor desolate slave girl too severely. If slavery had been abolished, I also could have married the man of my choice. I could have had a home shielded by the laws. I should have been spared the painful task of confessing what I am now about to relate, but all prospects have been blighted by slavery. I wanted to keep myself pure, and under most adverse circumstances I tried hard to preserve my self-respect, but I was struggling alone in the powerful grasp of the demon slavery, and the monster proved too strong for me. As I felt as if I were forsaken by God and man, as if all my efforts must be frustrated, and I became reckless in my despair." Though we can see Jacobs has high esteem for women's intentions, she also argues for the necessity of determined and resourceful action when an opportunity arises. Linda hides in a small hole in the wall while barely moving for 7 years, so that she may remain with her children. Later on in the narrative, she also demands to be able to sit and eat in a hotel dining room with other white guests at the discontent of the waiters. She goes on to state that, "My answer was that the colored servants ought to be dissatisfied with themselves for not having too much self-respect to submit to such treatment, that there was no difference in the price of board for colored and white servants, and there was no justification for difference of treatment. I stayed a month after this, and finding that I was resolved to stand up for my rights, they concluded to treat me well. Let every colored man and woman do this, and eventually we shall cease to be trampled underfoot by our oppressors." She uses the submission of her oppressed counterparts and the hotel to make a statement on the necessity to resist. In her article, Converting Passive Womanhood to Active Sisterhood, Jennifer Larson observes, "Jacobs' juxtaposition of active womanhood and passive womanhood becomes the main tool she employs to undermine the cult of true womanhood's requirement for purity and submissiveness. Jacobs firmly believes and argues that part of true womanhood is to boldly act womanly even in defiance of men and masters."